Hey gang, so what we're talking about here is the same time frame that we've been discussing over the last couple of lessons. Particularly, we're taking a look at here this 1870 to 1914 timeline. And what we're looking at with that, of course, is yesterday and the day before, we looked at Manifest Destiny, this idea that we have the right to expand our civilization to other countries of the world and other areas of the world. And then we also have this issue of the Spanish-American War, where America, while initially going after places like Hawaii and Japan and other islands in the Pacific, was also looking to expand into the Caribbean and into Latin America, places where Spain traditionally had colonies. So you saw us fight that war for a better part of a year, and you saw us in our closing arguments yesterday take control of Puerto Rico. Cuba with the Platt Amendment became a protectorate. You saw us take control of the Philippines as a colony, where we had paid a substantial amount of money to own those people and that land. And we're going to take a look at another part of the world right now, because while America's off busy during this, 1870 to, I'd say, about a little bit less than 1900, when we're busy doing this part of kind of the imperialistic nature of America, other parts of the world are also involved, and other countries of the world are still involved. And they're engaged in Asia. In particular, they're engaged in China. China then, as it is now, is quite possibly the place with the largest market available to sell goods. And you know from the tariff issues we talked about 2 lessons ago that the search for new markets is something that countries really want to get a hold of. China has those markets, and they purchase the least amount of our exports. So we're going to start to turn our attention from Latin America, from the Caribbean, Spanish possessions, islands in the Pacific that we'd already controlled. We're going to start shifting to Asia, where European countries were already involved. And I give you some examples on this slide why other countries are already involved there, in particular because China has a weak military, and there are nations that are right near it that are trying to start to exert influence. Japan and Russia, for example, begin to try and take advantage of China and actually go to war with each other over China, something we'll talk about here in a little bit. And, as Russia and other nations began to demand that China lease it land and give it special privileges, America's going to start to watch what's happening here very, very closely. And certainly, these 2 countries won't be the only ones at play. Those other countries that are in play, you can see them listed up here on the slide up above: Germany, France, Britain, Russia, and others. Italy is involved in this as well, as is Austria. Hungary wants to get involved in China. All of these nations in Europe are going to be looking to China as the place where it can begin to or continue to expand their empires. China, as it said before in the previous slide, does have a weak military, but it's not incredibly weak. It does have a strong enough military to prevent countries from taking it over entirely. So what these countries of Europe begin to do is come up with a more clever plan. They start to look to China almost as if it were a sick animal. And you can see from the slide that we have down here in the lower left, this issue of kind of a sick animal. And what you have here then is China as the dragon, and you have a series of different countries: Germany the eagle, the French rooster, Russian bear, the Japanese jaguar, the Australian double-headed eagle, etc. Italy here as the wolf, and what you're looking at here is them essentially going to carve up the most profitable parts of China. Which parts of China are going to be the best, and which parts of these can we get control over? But remember that China is too strong to conquer directly. So instead, they're going to be looking for something that they call a sphere of influence. They're going to say to China, all right, look, you're an independent country. What we want to do here is, we have military might, and we know we can cause you a lot of problems. Instead of getting into a war here where we're going to end up costing you and us terrible amounts of death and incredible expenditures, we want you to give us control over a small piece of your territory. Not the actual land, just the economic development inside that territory. So that, for example, here in orange on this upper map, anything inside the orange, the British nation gets to control economically. What gets bought, what gets sold, the taxes, the natural resources, all of that is controlled by Britain. And the same would go for France down here in the south part of China, or here in Japan and these little areas of China. These are what we're going to call spheres of influence. And I know they're not spheres, actual spheres, but the idea here, of course, is that you have a globe or a planet, and this is the region, kind of like a moon, that you have influence over, just like the moon is in the influence of the Earth's gravity, so too is this section of China in the influence of those countries' gravity. So this section is in the influence of Britain's gravity, and so on. And these spheres of influence allow these bigger nations to control economic development and, of course, make them have a much better chance at controlling the region. The other thing I want to point out here is that this is extraordinarily competitive. If you take a look at the eyes of each of these animals, they're not looking at China, so to speak. They're looking at each other. These animals are too busy thinking about what the other is going to do, that what you should understand is there's a real risk of a global war breaking out. Because we have these huge empires around the world, we know that nations like Russia and Japan are going to go to war over China. We could see our first world war over China. And there is a nation not involved here in the background, the United States. So with this premise of a looming potential world war, or at least a huge conflict over who controls what in China, America stands back and sees this and says, we've got to get involved here. Number one, we need to get involved in economic imperialism. But number two, we've got to prevent a costly war. To make sure that none of these other countries can really make a war happen in China, what you're going to see is the United States begin to promote something that you can, or that we're going to call here, as William McKinley did back in 1899, the open door policy. This is something that goes out, it's an idea of McKinley's, it goes out in 1899, and essentially what they're saying here is that everyone in the world should have equal access to China and its trading benefits. This ideally will stop countries from competing with one another and potentially getting into conflict, which could cause great disaster. So you have here, for example, in this political cartoon, all these countries of the world carving up China. Sooner or later, they're going to bump into each other and they're going to cause all kinds of trouble. But at the same time, you see America saying, look, we've got this treaty right here that if you can sign this open door policy, then we're going to be able to trade with you. We'll all be able to trade together. And then we won't run in the risk of some kind of global war. And that only works if every single one of these countries that we mentioned in the previous slide agrees to do it. If you don't all get in on this together, then you're only going to have some people say, well, if he's not doing it, I'm not going to do it. And he's not doing it, I'm not going to do it. So what you have to have here are people all willing to get on the same page. Everyone does agree, but there's one group of people that they didn't actually get permission from when it came to this kind of open access to trading with China, and that's China. And as you can imagine, that makes the Boxers, or I should say rather the Chinese people, very, very upset. I mean, I'm pretty sure we'd all be upset if that's exactly what happened to our country. So if you see here in this next slide that the Chinese themselves have lost control of their country. When you have foreign powers from the other side of the world basically saying, we're going to carve up your country and take full control without asking you, that's going to make some real anger. So a group of rebels begins to form. They call themselves the Society of Harmonious and Righteous Fists. Their nickname is the Boxers. Get it? Fists, harmonious and righteous fists, Boxers. Get it? And their desire here is to completely destroy foreign influence. I'm not talking about asking it to leave. I'm not talking about asking it to play nice. I'm talking about destroying it, kicking it out. Adios, sayonara, see you later. You're not going to be around. And they go after foreigners in the capital of China, Beijing, right as the 1900s begin. And they win. They win. They kill several hundred foreigners. They drive back several foreign armies that aren't cooperating together. And it's a disaster for the armies of the Western nations. Now, if you think they're going to let that stand, you're crazy. Because what you're going to see here for these people is... well, at least for the people that are trying to take over and to have in China these spheres of influence, you're going to see them say, you know what, we're not putting up with this. The United States, along with a number of other nations, you can see us here paired with England in this particular picture, but we're going to see all the nations of Europe, including Austria-Hungary, Britain, etc. We submit an army of about 17,000 people we send to China, and we promise them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness under treaty rights. In other words, you get to be who you want to be under the treaty that we established for you. So take that, and you want some democracy? Come get some, okay? Yeah, come get the democracy. And the Chinese, of course, will end up losing. They are routed. And that will be the end of real Chinese resistance to this. Looking at all of this, I think what you see here is a world where, in terms of imperialism, America is no longer afraid to use her military might, as we shown in the Spanish-American War, and combine that with diplomatic imperialism, with the open door policy, so that we end up with an America that has a serious influence around the world, changing events in China, the Caribbean, and in the Pacific. Many Americans thought that this was the right path, that we were really doing the right thing here between the Spanish-American War at the end of the 1900s, William McKinley with the open door policy in China, changing the way America gained access to those markets. People think that America's on the right path. A lot of people do anyway when it comes to foreign policy. What would have been, we can't really tell because McKinley gets shot. He was initially president from 1896 to 1900. He was reelected in 1900 for a second four-year term, and he comes out of that second four-year term, and he's actually going to be assassinated, I should say, by a guy named Leon Czolgosz. And here's what happens. McKinley is up in northern New York. He's at a festival up there. He's out shaking hands. He's meeting people, greeting people. And this guy, Czolgosz, he's an anarchist. He doesn't believe in government. He thinks that people like McKinley are the reason why immigrants are oppressed. So he shoots McKinley, and McKinley dies. And he's replaced by this guy who's his vice president, a guy named Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, as president, is, I think it's pretty safe to say that he's going to conclude, or I should say rather continue, McKinley's policies as president, at least when it comes to foreign policy, because if there's one thing you need to remember about Teddy Roosevelt, it's that he is big on strength. The stronger your muscles, the bigger your guns, the more you can get done. I want you to think of Teddy Roosevelt over this next slide or two, that everything he does here is within the context of displaying American power. His goal is to show the world that we are strong and that we are the moral compass of the world. He wants to influence less civilized societies. In essence, what Teddy Roosevelt is essentially going to do here is turn America into the world's police force. He views America within that lens, that we have a responsibility to get done what is best for our country, but at the same time to do what's best for democracy. Manifest Destiny on crack, because now we have a huge empire, we have access to huge markets, and we're very, very strong. So, let me give you an example of how he does this. War was going to break out in the early 1900s, around 1904 and 1905. It's going to break out between Russia and Japan. They had been competing for some time over China. And those nations were definitely interested in seeing more and more influence in that part of the world. So when this war breaks out, it's not very good, not going very good at all for the Russians, but that's besides the point, because Teddy Roosevelt looks at this and says, this is not how the modern powers of the world should function. We just spent all this time working up the open door policy, giving equal access to China, and now two of the parties involved in that we didn't want to go to war are fighting a war. It's not going to work. So what Roosevelt does as the world's police force is he displays American strength by sitting these two parties down at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to sign a treaty. There's no one that's going to control trade. Russia and Japan, you will agree to peace. There will be no fighting over China. There will be no spheres of influence. We had them. Open door under McKinley gets rid of them. You can't bring them back. And it's going to work. This is a great example of Roosevelt using American military and political and economic might to force countries to do his bidding in a place like China. Another way you can look at Roosevelt in terms of strength and displaying American strength is with the Panama Canal. This is a canal that the French had been building through Panama, or trying to build, for about 10 years. They had a couple of goals here. Prior to this, if you had to ship any goods around the world, you ended up having to go a really, really, really long way. You would have to go, so for example, there's a little Latin America, and there's Mexico, and here's the United States, okay? Now, if you wanted to ship goods around the world, let's say from New York, what you ended up having to do here was ship them all the way down and around and then off to wherever it is you wanted to go. The Panama Canal is going to come along and say, you know what, you don't have to do that. You can just go like this. Oh, yeah. That's pretty awesome. At least in the idea of displaying power, right? Because it's easy to cut costs for the businesses of America that are shipping goods all over the world, and it's also a way to show our military might, because now we can move our navy to either side of the world incredibly quickly, and we can display our strengths without people having or without us having to worry about who's in control and who's doing that work. So Roosevelt comes in here and he wants to take over this construction of the Panama Canal, and he wants to overcome things that had never been overcome, like the disease that killed thousands of Frenchmen and Panamanians who'd been working there, so and create a project that is gargantuan. You see this little dot right down here? That's a person. So we're talking about a huge canal being built here. And Roosevelt himself actually says, you know what, we can do this. No one has to be worried about how we're going to handle this, because I'm going down there myself and I'm going to take care of it. That's Roosevelt working a crane in the Panama Canal. He's brilliant, and he demands that America build this canal, and they create whole new ways of handling diseases, whole new ways of creating healthy working conditions and surviving in jungle environments, and building this canal and then controlling it. The Americans controlled this canal in somebody else's country. If you wanted to go through the canal, you had to play by our rules and be our friend. This is a really important strategic piece of work that's done by Americans, and it really is a great way of Teddy Roosevelt saying, if you want to play nice and use our canal, be kind to the police, right? Be kind to America. You know, I like that idea of Roosevelt saying to other countries, be kind to America, because that summarizes, I think, really well his foreign policy. If we were going to take a look at all of his foreign policy goals, whether it's the Panama Canal or the Treaty of Portsmouth or anything else, I think this idea of speaking softly and carrying a big stick is exactly that. Because what Roosevelt says here is that America, as the world's police force, has to set an example. We need to be able to tell the other nations of the world what they should or shouldn't do, and do it in a way that's fair. So here you've got Teddy Roosevelt in a policeman's uniform telling other people of the world, whether it's people in India, like that you can see here, or Turkey, or people in Latin America, or people in Europe, Asia. He tells them what to do and how to think and how to behave, and if they don't listen, then they get the big stick, right? So they can follow treaties or decisions that he makes, or you can take American military might and authority and take it on the chin. And Roosevelt isn't the only guy, of course, or the only person that's really going to kind of stand by and let those nations take place. Let me give you a very specific example of this kind of speak softly and carry a big stick idea. It's called the Roosevelt Corollary. What Roosevelt says is that way back in the 1800s, a president that we had named Monroe came up with an idea. He said, we're going to have something called the Monroe Doctrine. And that doctrine says that America is able to intervene or protect North America and Central America. You can't come over here and get involved. You can't mess up our countries. You're not allowed. You're to stay out. Well, now Roosevelt's going to say, you know what, we're going to actually expand that. America's now a nation or a worldwide business powerhouse. And if we're a worldwide business powerhouse, then we've got economic interest in way more than just Central America, Mexico, Nicaragua, Honduras, etc., and North America, but also South America. So he's going to say, look, you can't come to any of this half of the world, and we're going to intervene. If you get involved in these places and you mess them up, we're going to protect our business interests, however that requires, treaty or military. It's a really forward way of saying to the world that we are strong enough to be masters of our own house. Other presidents to come after Roosevelt are also going to kind of continue this idea of influencing this half of the world and preventing people from getting involved here. The 27th president of the United States, William Howard Taft, is going to use something called dollar diplomacy. His idea is, instead of using the military to keep Latin America friendly with us, we're going to use what's called dollar diplomacy. The concept is that we will support Latin American industry and Latin American governments with American dollars. We give you American dollars to build infrastructure, to increase trade, to allow American companies to operate in your country, and we protect you and we help you keep yourself safe from local rebellions to keep yourself in power. It's a great way for us to use the dollar instead of the military to be successful in countries in Latin America. Woodrow Wilson, who comes in from 1914 to 1918, Wilson is going to say, you know what, I'm not so sure that we're going to necessarily approach things in the same violent way that you see these other countries or these other presidents doing, at least when it comes to foreign affairs. What I would rather do, says Wilson, is have something called moral diplomacy. I want America to do what's just. I want that to be our guiding light. It shouldn't be about our money forcing us to intervene in other countries. It shouldn't be about our military forcing us to go to war with other countries. What we should do is worry about America's foreign policy from the perspective of what's the right thing to do. I'll give you an example for this. Down in Mexico, there was a revolution in 1910, and it was getting really, really worse by the time Wilson gets into power in 1914. So what Wilson does is actually send our military into Mexico in 1914 to try and restore law and order, because that's not, in Wilson's mind, having a military overthrow the government, that's not moral, that's not just. In his mind, you need to use law and order in order to kind of make that happen. You got to use the ballot box. So there's an example of Wilson using moral diplomacy. We're going to leave it with that for right there, and I think we'll pick up with more of this tomorrow as we talk about kind of some foreign policy ideas here in the age of imperialism in some of our activities in class.